Since it's already a touch after 8, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We'll wait until any specific chapter discussions that need to occur until after the speaker, because I want to make sure that we have all the time in the world that we can dedicate to what Kim wants to present to us this evening. A quick introduction. So Dr. Kim Klockow-McClain has, gosh, I've known her for quite a while. She's amazing. So y'all are in for a treat. She's gotten her bachelor's degree from Purdue, master's and doctorate from University of Oklahoma, has quite the impressive resume with being a Congressional Science Fellow and working at NOAA headquarters, and then recently, well, not too recently, but currently working for the National Severe Storms Lab. And this evening is going to be talking about risk communication related to tornado threats, and I will pass it off to you, Kim, to give a more detailed introduction and get the ball rolling.
That's great. No, thank you, Amanda. And yeah, I've known you a long time. I think I met you my first year in my master's at OU, probably because we were grad students together.
Right.
Yeah, that's, I don't want to
a while.
But it's been a few.
Yeah.
So, hi everybody. It's so nice to join you all this evening. And I know that some of you heard this, but there is currently some stormy weather hitting Norman. It's a perfect setting for this conversation with you all this evening. But I apologize in advance if I get overridden by the atmosphere. So I am at the National Severe Storms Laboratory, but have a sort of split disciplinary background myself. I'm a trained meteorologist, but also a behavioral scientist. So my role at the lab has been to help start a behavioral science group there. I run the Behavioral Insights Unit. And so my talk today will be a bit of a fusion of some severe weather with an angle toward human behavior. And I'm especially interested in tornado epidemiology. When I would say that, more than a year ago, people would look at me with quizzical looks like, well, what even is epidemiology? Well, now that we've all lived through the COVID era, I think we have a much deeper appreciation for what that really means. I'm very interested in studying how it is that people survive severe weather, and what are some of the structural determinants of that, and also what are the behavioral determinants of that, and what can we do as messengers to inform the behavioral aspect, also recognizing the structural aspect exists. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and get into the presentation, and let's see, that'll be a share. Okay, are you guys able to see the presentation?
Yes.
All right, is it now in presentation mode?
Yes, it is.
Great, fantastic. All right, so let's talk a little bit about improving risk communication for tornado threats. And I like to start this talk with, an image that sort of hits at the heart of all of us who work in this field. I think a lot of us get into this to try to help people in the face of something like this that looks, let's be honest with ourselves, it looks unsurvivable. You look at damage like this and you think to yourself, how could someone possibly make it through that? In this case, this is an image of the Beauregard, Alabama tornado from March 3rd, 2019. And this was an area that had a number of fatalities. And this, I think, was the largest fatality event we've had since that date of 23 individuals who perished in this tornado. And when we have events like this that occur, a lot of questions are raised. We always sort of ask, well, how could we have done better? And when you especially have a high fatality event, it really hits at a personal level for every meteorologist that worked the event. You sort of feel like every one of those people was on me in some way to protect. What did I do? How did I fail? And we take it on ourselves. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of the process of introspection that I see our field go through in asking these questions, and reveal some ways that maybe we're a little harder on ourselves than we need to be, and there might be other ways to think about the problem. So I looked at this event, the March 3rd, 2019 event, and found, I sort of archived some of the big pieces that were going on in the immediate days following the event. And sort of the first wave of reckoning was this, great forecast recognition. After especially the tornadoes that were so deadly in 2011, this has really been the story. We had great forecasts. The warnings were spot on. So what happened? The first level is to sort of look at, well, we thought that we had good hazard communication going on. And in the case of this event, there was all of this discussion of even the Storm Prediction Center. This was when they debuted this, very specific mesoscale convective discussion, where they started to call out this couple of counties area, sort of what's going to possibly become the warn on forecast contribution, to filling the watch and warning gap. And they've done that for this event. And so there's sort of this level of disbelief, almost frustration. We really did a good job. Why did this yet result in fatalities? And then we bring in the people who are, geographers. Amanda is, this is our discipline, kind of takes a step in, and behavioral scientists and other people who kind of look at some of the vulnerability layers and of the populations that were affected. And in this case, Stephen pointed out, there were a lot of people who lived in very vulnerable housing in the way of this tornado. It appears that the majority of the fatalities actually occurred in mobile and manufactured housing. And then you get this next level of reckoning. This was the New York Times after that became popularized. The tornado warning gave Alabamians 12 minutes to prepare. 23 people died anyway, and they, sort of talk about a warning for the ferocious tornadoes issued quickly, but in a place with widespread poverty and few places to hide, it could not save everyone. We get this bit of fatalism that sort of creeps in. And Dennis Mercereau, who was at the time writing for, I believe, Gawker, wrote about it, and he said, a human being simply cannot survive that kind of storm without being underground or deep within a much stronger structure. Many people in weaker homes are out in the country, and they simply have nowhere to go to ride out a storm like that. A tornado warning is only as good as your ability to act on it. I agree with the part that the warning is only as good as your ability to act on it. And that concept goes all the way back to the Alan Murphy, forecast. How do you think about the quality and value of a forecast? Value is produced through a user's ability to actually take that information and do something with it. But I disagree wholeheartedly with the rest of the sentiment. And I'll explain everything that I disagree with in detail here in a minute, but especially that bit of you can't survive unless you're underground or deep within a much stronger structure, and we'll talk about that. So I want to sort of preface that discussion of the tornado epidemiology with a fundamental sort of basic model for how people process risk information and make choices to respond. So you can think of this as sort of, highlighting how people come to their behavior, at least an aspect of it. The model is called the extended parallel process model, and by parallel, it really just means two. There are two major tracks of things your mind is evaluating in parallel as the event is going on, as the crisis unfolds. One piece of it is threat appraisal. You're asking, well, what is the hazard? How bad is it? And how susceptible am I? This is the piece that the Weather Service tends to emphasize a great deal. I mean, this is sort of our bread and butter in meteorology. We are hazard detectors, hazard quantifiers, and hazard visualizers, all of that piece. And it's a very important part. It is a necessary precondition to response, but it's not a sufficient condition for response. There's another part running in parallel that needs to be addressed, and that's coping appraisal. This is where people ask themselves questions like, well, what actions can I take that will help me? This is called response efficacy in the communication literature. And then they ask, can I actually take those actions? So even if I know what to do, can I actually do it? Do I have access to the things that are needed? Do I have access to a shelter? Do I have access to, whatever, XYZ? Do I have enough time? They appraise their ability to actually cope with the situation. And depending on how these two things interact, several different tracks are possible. One that we hope that people will follow is that they're motivated. And that happens when the threat appraisal is high and the coping appraisal is high. When these things move together, you get a motivated person, and this is a person that you will see act to control the danger. But then there are some things that can go wrong when they're not both high. You can get the case where you have perhaps high threat appraisal but low coping appraisal. So people know that there's a threat, but they really either don't know what to do about it or they don't feel they can do anything about it, and they can feel defensive. In that case, you'll see them act to control the fear rather than to control the hazard. And I'll bring up COVID a couple times as an example because we've all lived this over the last year. Think about all the people that you knew last year who did not feel that they understood what they even were supposed to do, or did not feel that they could do things to keep themselves safe when COVID was unfolding. And they threw all kinds of different reactions that were not proactive toward actually mitigating the threat. They were perhaps denying that COVID existed. They were, perhaps suggesting that so little was known or understood, that there was nothing they could really do anyway. They might have been fatalistic. Those kinds of things can happen when these things are misaligned. Of course, there was a lot going on behind the scenes of that, but that's a really nice example of how that can come about. And then a third, yet even worse track than this, is people can have really high threat appraisal, low coping appraisal, and just get stuck in a cycle of fear. They can just literally get paralyzed. These are people who, it's good to be a little bit afraid so that you're motivated to actually do something about a threat. But if you get somebody to the point where they're so scared they can't even move, that's also bad. And these are people who can go through a weather event and come out with PTSD, even if they're not hit, because they're just sitting there so anxious. And I know in Oklahoma, this has been something we've been dealing with since the 2013 tornadoes. There's been a wide recognition that we have people with PTSD. They call the Weather Service forecast office every time some weather's possible, just in tears and panicking. And there's been a whole mental health effort undertaken to try to ameliorate this. So this is certainly something that we should be aware of, and that, there's a balance here. You need to strike a kind of balance between these two parallel tracks. So the path to improving, I think, if we're looking at the behavioral goal of this, the behavioral component of tornado survivability, our goal should really not just be about tweaking people into fear. It should be about informed decision making. And this is a fundamentally different frame than many meteorologists use. A lot of people in our field will hear that people, for example, haven't responded to tornado warnings, in some place and after some event, and they'll think, well, people just aren't listening to us. We have to hit that button harder and make them know, no, this is really something you have to pay attention to. It's a natural inclination when you feel like there's a risk and you work so hard to get people to understand it. And it just seems like all you see is that they're not behaving as you think they should. And so you're sort of thinking, well, maybe you're just not afraid enough of it. And that kind of puts us in a position where we see ourselves as the ones who need to make the decision for people. We're the ones who are sort of in control and command, and we feel that responsibility to get people to act. But informed decision making kind of flips that around and puts the onus on the other person. And with that in mind, you say, okay, suddenly I'm just interested in making sure that you know everything you need to know, both about the hazard and about your options for responding to it. And then the ball is in your court. I have done everything I can do. Now the ball is in your court. So that's a framework that we're thinking about at the Severe Storms Lab as we do things like pursue facets, the paradigm for reinvigorating the watch warning advisory system with technological improvements that could perhaps offer more time. We're doing research with end users to assure that we're informing their decision making. You can also do things where you're looking to just assure that, okay, while we're messaging about hazard, are we doing anything to assure that people have access to adequate response options? And I'm going to shift the talk a little bit to talk about adequacy of response options. So first, to get into this, do we have evidence? This is a fundamental question. Do we have evidence that improvements in the warning system that have gone on for decades, because we've had great technological improvements, great improvements in our communication infrastructure, has that had an impact that we can measure? Before we really start to berate ourselves too badly and try to think about, what are we missing and how can we improve? What's our baseline? And the good news is, yes, we can see that for tornado fatalities, when you go back to in the whole record back to the 1870s and look at the deaths per million population, which is a nice way to think about, normalized, how likely are you to be in the United States and die from a tornado over time? You see that from about 1925 on, and this is a log linear scale, there's this really notable decline in fatalities. It's been about an order of magnitude decline in about a century. And so that's really good news. But so there's sort of a backstory to this story. And it's what happens when you take this figure and break it out into housing type. So in this figure, the white squares are people who live in permanent homes. And the black squares are people who live in mobile and manufactured housing. And what you see is for people who live in mobile and manufactured housing, the fatality rate is almost identical to before the warning system ever existed, before we ever started communicating about tornadoes at all, through any of our mass communication channels, before the National Weather Service was even called the National Weather Service. Our fatality rate is, for those populations, is about the same, which tells us that for them, the warning system isn't doing much, if anything. And, making a note about this, you've probably heard about the existence of a program called Vortex Southeast. It probably exists because of this figure, because of the deep saturation of mobile and manufactured housing in that region. But being in North Texas, that bleeds into your area too. You have significant fractions of your population that exist in mobile and manufactured housing. And in your area, those are likely to also be people who have other kinds of vulnerabilities, like speaking English as a second language, and so on. And so that's something that you certainly contend with as well outside of the urban core. So let's take a look at some of the research that's been done under the guise of Vortex Southeast. Let's learn a little bit about what is it that people who live in mobile and manufactured housing are doing? Do they have these pieces where they understand what safe shelter is? Do they know what they're supposed to do? What kinds of things are they doing when severe weather happens? And there was a really nice study that was undertaken of both mobile home, MH in this graphic, and fixed home, FH, residents, about 500 in each category in the Southeast. And they were asking questions about, when you receive warnings, where do you tend to be? You can see that there's maybe a small difference in that some people who are mobile home residents are at work a little bit more often than are at home as compared to fixed home residents. But otherwise, things look pretty similar. So people when warnings are issued, when people find themselves having to respond to a tornado, for the most part, they're in the same kinds of places. Now, this study was done 2 or 3 years ago, and there's been some work that's gone on in the Southeast since then on this issue. So I'd be interested to see if this is revised, but I suspect not hugely, at least not yet. But it's important to think about this because when the warning is on those mobile manufactured housing residents, there's not a lot that they can do other than shelter in place. So I don't try to take this graphic all in. I'm going to walk you through a couple of key things I see from this. They break out actions into very specific subcategories. And a couple things I'll highlight. For people who are in fixed homes versus permanent homes, these are the actions that people take when they're under a tornado warning. 20% of people in fixed homes say, the first thing they do is they shelter inside their house. And it's much, much lower for manufactured housing populations. So what are they doing differently? Well, it's it turns out that it's not fleeing. At the warning time scale, about as many people who live in fixed homes as manufactured homes say that they're attempting to shelter away from the home. One of the things that stuck out to me was this sense, it was on this prayer category, and that being markedly different to people in mobile homes versus fixed homes. And to me, that them saying that their first inclination is to pray screams of a emotion-focused coping response. They look at that situation and they don't feel that they can actually do what they need to do to feel like they're sheltering and responding to it, and so they're trying to handle their emotions. And opposing people living in that situation, we have communicators who are giving messages sort of like this one. This was a very famous, Mike Morgan has sort of, he stands by this even to this day, that he made this proclamation for the May 31st, 2013 El Reno tornado as it was bearing down on the Oklahoma City metro. I mean, this thing did look awful. And we were a traumatized population in central Oklahoma after the May 20th tornado. And I get it on one level. I watched this happen live, though, and I was horrified to hear him say this. Please don't ride this out in any interior closet or bathroom. Don't, because it is violent. It is a violent multi-vortex large tornado. He was suggesting that the shelter that was available to almost everyone, because we don't really have basements here in Oklahoma, and while some people do have shelters, it's by far not everybody. He was suggesting that most people were unsafe from the tornado. And lo and behold, what happened? I mean, we saw tens of thousands, if not 100,000 people hit the roads. And I mean, I was in Norman, 30 miles south. Amanda, were you still in Norman or were you out in Georgia at this point? You weren't here?
No.
Okay. It was a pretty horrific thing, and I had planned to head to the Weather Center, which was just a mile from my apartment at the time as a grad student. And I looked at this and I said, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it. And I mean, that traffic stretched all the way from Oklahoma City into Norman. The roads in Norman were blocked. The Highway 9 that borders Norman on the south, that runs right past the National Weather Center, was jammed. People were abandoning their cars and walking to the Weather Center because it was the tallest building they could see. They had no idea what it was. They were just going to a building because the storm, after the tornado, after the storm occluded, the tornado lifted, it started to go toward the southeast, and they were listening on the radio to this coverage, and people were just fleeing their cars. And at the same time, in the lower left corner, you can see there was an actual flash flood threat, which was what ended up killing the most people in this event. It wasn't the tornado. And it was a real mess. This is collective emotion-focused coping. This is a collective action failure of epic proportions that happened in, the South Central Plains, not too different from the Dallas-Fort Worth metro. Our populations are the most tornado-savvy of anywhere on the planet. We have more access to technology, to terrific weather service forecasters, to amazing broadcast meteorologists, to incredible emergency managers. Our whole IWT is a sophisticated outfit, and this happened here. So that suggests that there is a really big component that we need to reckon with, and it's just almost it's chilling still to revisit these images. It happened before, and it could happen again. So out of this kind of an event, and hearing that messaging, I ask, do people know what kinds of structures are safe from tornadoes? And this includes meteorologists. We are, in the field of meteorology, essentially, we're given a mission that's risk communication, especially in the National Weather Service. The mission is to save lives and protect property. Those are behavioral objectives. We are trying to communicate something that inspires other people to behave in a certain way. And we are not taught anything about human behavior, nor are we taught this piece about tornado epidemiology, most people don't know the fundamental statistics on how survivable different structures are. And it seems very natural that we'll try to be zero, like we don't tolerate risk, like get to the safest place. So, we need to ask, well, who exactly is it that needs to flee? Is it everyone? And we ask this question in the facets world when we're looking at new technologies opening up the response horizon. We might increase lead time to an hour. Will more people flee? That could be a tragedy of the commons if we don't target our messaging a little bit. This is very concerning for us. So, looking at the Mike Morgan quote here, he was messaging this way, yes. But the National Weather Service, it's important to note, was taking a more conservative stance on it. It says, sort of, if possible, move to a basement or storm shelter. Otherwise, move to an interior room, hallway on the lowest floor. So we have a little bit of, we're definitely not unified in the messaging that we're sending on what kinds of options people have to handle the threat. So let's ask ourselves, okay, tell me epidemiology, Kim. What does it take to survive a tornado? You've highlighted that we probably don't know the statistics. What are they? One of the very first studies of an epidemiological evaluation of a tornado was just down the road from you guys in Wichita Falls after the '79 tornado. And this event was really, really famous for the fatalities in cars, since there were a lot of people who tried to flee the neighborhood that's pictured here, and a lot of people perished in cars. But there is an interesting addendum that I'll note. So, yes, 60% of the fatalities were people who, they say in the report, despite ample warning, went to their cars to drive out of the storm's path. These people had a very high risk of serious or fatal injury. But the next point is one I want you to focus on. For people who remained indoors and in stationary homes, they were relatively low risk. For a violent tornado, their fatality rate was 3 per 1,000 exposed. So when you hear the fatality counts out of these events, it's really important to take into account, well, how many people were there? And we're used to thinking of this now, fatality rate, because of COVID. It's the exact same thing as looking at COVID has the 1 to 2% fatality rate. That's exactly what we're talking about here. We have to know the base rate. We have to know how many people were actually in harm's way. We don't gather that information systematically. We're really good at counting deaths. We're not really good at counting survivors. And I question why. Because if we don't, then we can end up with this really inflated sense of, oh, that number seems really big, lots of people died. In this event, if you were in a well-built home, you had almost perfect odds of survival. Really, really high odds of survival. The people who had much worse odds were people in mobile homes. They were at a risk of 85 per 1,000 exposed, which is a factor of about 30. They were 30 times more likely to die. 30 times. So keep that factor in mind. Let's go to another tornado that had some really good epidemiology done on it. May 3rd, 1999, the Moore tornado. So Tom Schmidlin, a geographer at Kent State University, he did a really nice sequence of different kinds of tornado studies in the 90s and early 2000s. And one of these was a really systematic epidemiological evaluation. He looked at specifically people who were in the F4 and F5 damage from the Moore tornado. And of those who remained in their homes, he found 1% were killed, just 1%. And the CDC went in and evaluated the entire tornado, and there's a lot of odds ratios and things listed here. I'll summarize it in this graph. You can look at house is sort of the parallel lines bar on the far left, then people who are in apartments and people who are in mobile homes. The risk of death for people in mobile homes was about an order of magnitude higher than people who were in permanent homes. Again, people who were in permanent homes had a survivability odds of about 90-something percent. It was quite high in the F5 tornado, which was epic. I mean, that was an epic F5 tornado, extremely violent tornado. And then in 2011, there were some studies done on Joplin and the April 27th outbreak. And one of the studies I was a part of by Amber Cannon, she looked at, she made an estimate of the number of people across all of Alabama who were exposed to the tornado based on census tract data. And so it's not perfect, but it's pretty good exposure estimate for all of the tornadoes that occurred that day. And so this isn't just F4s, EF4s, EF5s. This was all of the tornadoes across the whole state. But she found that the death rate by exposed population was 1 out of 350. There were 345 survivors for every person who died in a tornado that day, which is just incredible. I mean, really, we should look at that and think, we're doing something really right. That is pretty profound. In Jasper County, the Joplin tornado, the emergency manager there for the county estimated there were 12,500 people in the path of that tornado, which gives us, with 160 some fatalities, a fatality rate of 1.2%. In Joplin, that was a horrible tornado. So the fundamental thing I think that we're missing is the knowledge as meteorologists that tornadoes are survivable, especially if you're not in a mobile and manufactured home and if you are able to drive away. So we really have a very targeted audience for a lot of our messaging, and that's mobile home residents. That's who we have to reach. That is the most important group to reach. And in your area, I would also put in with that people who are drivers. You have a lot of people who are going through your area. Sorry, can you still see my screen? Okay, sorry, I had a little pop-up. So I think it's important for us to keep in mind we have very specific audiences who really, really need our attention. But so often we hear this refrain about unsurvivability for most. You hear this time and time again, that tornado was unsurvivable, and it will be unsurvivable unless you are doing this very nth degree thing. Why? Why do we do this? I think, we as meteorologists, we're not nearly as good at telling people when they're safe as telling them that they're at risk. We see ourselves as risk communicators and not necessarily safety educators. And there's a slight difference to this. But telling people about what it takes to make them safe is really, really important. And knowing that it's something as ordinary as being in a built home is really, really empowering. Imagine that you live in a mobile home, but you have family that lives just across the plot of land from you in a house. How motivating is it if you know that that could give you almost perfect odds of survival to just go up there and be there, spend some time up there, spend an hour. That is so much more tenable than telling people you have to get to a FEMA-rated community shelter or something. It's so much more accessible, and it's something that we should really, really be doing. I think, we're also more inclined to, because we're in this position of being risk communicators, we'd hate to have something happen where, well, what if people do go to a permanent home and they die? What if they go to that permanent home because I told them that it'd be safe and they perish? And so we put ourselves in this position where, well, I only feel comfortable telling you the most safe option rather than helping people weigh their options. We take what's called an abstinence-only approach. This is very much like abstinence-only education, which it's been so interesting to me to watch COVID, through the messaging that's gone on. It was very, very similar early on. It was very much abstinence only. No seeing other people, no doing anything, no going to work, no having daycare, no having, other surgeries, no having absolutely anything else go on. And in that, because that happened, we put people in this extraordinary position of having to cut off every single other thing in their life for what could be years. We were asking people to do this. And, sort of put on the back burner the profound economic realities and everything else. And abstinence only can create the kinds of backlash that I covered in the extended parallel process model, the denial, and people who find themselves in crippling fear. And those are not great things. You get a lot of emotion-focused coping that way. And there's been, in the medical community, a lot of people who are advocating for something they're calling harm reduction. So it's not harm elimination. They're advocating for harm reduction. Try to help people, try to inform their decisions, try to help them understand their trade-offs. Understand, here's sort of an ordinate of things that you can do. And maybe this is the best one, but if you don't have access to that, try this and try this and try this. And out of, in COVID, there's been sort of the Swiss cheese model. If you have layered, do masking, do hand washing, keep social distancing, and have moderate, things that you're doing. All those things layered together can sort of fill the gaps and be reasonable, and you can still do some of the things you need to do in your life. And that turns out to be a much more motivational thing because people have response efficacy. They understand what to do. They feel like they actually can do it. You haven't set the bar so high that you just miss people entirely. And this is what's the philosophy behind what the Weather Service has. They teamed up with FEMA and recently put out this set of guidelines. It's about harm reduction and helping people to understand the spectrum of things that can be done. I was working with them on this and contributing some of the epidemiology literature to help them delineate these options. They had some pretty significant lobbying by the manufactured housing industry, which in the Southeast has been trying to argue that, oh no, we're so much better than mobile homes. We're actually quite safe, stable structures to be in. And because they've been pushing so hard and advocating so hard for this, the Weather Service is getting pressured to put them in a good options category. It's important to know manufactured housing still fares pretty poorly unless it's really well anchored and a very specific set of things are there. But even so, it's in the spectrum of things. Maybe it's better than being in a car, but not much and not necessarily. So I'll wrap up with a simple recommendation. Seeing ourselves in this risk communication seat. Don't tell people that they won't survive unless they're in a perfectly safe situation, because just frankly, it's a lie. They will almost certainly survive. And a lot of people know this. I think that that's something that's not helping us get a lot of trust with our audiences when we message that way. They think that we're overblowing it because we probably are. You can encourage safe behaviors without going too far. So, don't be afraid to tell people to aim for something just a little bit higher. We should, just a little bit better. We should be focusing on harm reduction, not elimination. There's a really nice phrase that I learned when I was in DC doing policy stuff. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And I really like that. I really, really like that. And it's stuck with me. And it's what I use to think about this problem. So with that, happy to have any discussion or questions. I think there's a lot in here that we can all resonate with, having lived through what we've lived through the past year. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. That was amazing. I appreciate it. If anybody has any specific questions, feel free to unmute and ask away.
I've covered it all so well. They're like, yeah, no.
Hi, this is Bernard. I've been having discussions recently. My cousin has moved into a tiny house in North Carolina, and we're talking with her strategy. First of all, I'm getting her a weather radio, which she didn't have before. But the strategies they were looking at, talking to her neighbors, of hopping in a car and driving to the Walmart, which is some distance away. I see your facial reaction. There is one sort of stone structure that's been for a while on the property. And I think I've convinced her that that is probably the best place for her to go under the circumstances. There was a question at one point, was it always locked? And I think they've talked to the owners and made sure they can get access to it. It's a question of whether or not it has a basement, but it's an older stone structure, been around for a while, and probably reasonably well constructed. So again, I think that's probably her best option, although she still has to convince her neighbors to not hop in the car and drive to Walmart.
That sounds right on, and I feel like you should be very confident in being able to make those suggestions. Walmart, unfortunately, it's happening here too. The city has been sort of systematically shutting down a lot of its storm shelters in the wake of these like crazy mass evacuation events, because public facilities were just getting overwhelmed, and emergency managers found themselves in this position of, you know, having to turn people away at the last minute when a tornado is bearing down, and that is just something they did not want to have to deal with. The liability of all of it, and they just said, if we can't shelter, if the demand exceeds our supply, we're just going to say no. We can't do this. And what's happened is people have started to do things like go to Walmart. I know someone who works at a Walmart here, and he's sort of taken on the just unpaid position of being sort of their like emergency response coordinator when the hordes start rushing in at the Walmart on the east side. And it's just we learned in dynamics class that Walmart is, because Bernoulli says, it is like the worst thing to possibly be in. It's just going to peel the roof right off, and with the cinder block walls, I mean, just those did not fare very well in Joplin. You know, if you were to go through and do the epidemiological analysis, I'm pretty sure that would have a fatality rate that's very comparable to mobile manufactured housing. So I wholly support your messaging. It sounds really, really good.
Say, Dr. Kim, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is based on your research that you're doing, is there any recommendations being given to the National Weather Service field offices about changing any of their tornado warning or severe thunderstorm warning call to action statements or anything like that? Because we've been using the same canned statements for years. And it sounds like you're onto something here. And I'm just wondering what recommendations you can give to the field offices to try to improve their messaging during severe weather.
You know what? It'd be really interesting to do a little study to sort of see if we were to have a call to action that talked about, you know, something like try to get to something a little bit better rather than just, you know, be in a basement, what have you, try to say, you know, if you're in a building like this or this or this, try to get to a this or this or this. So having that little delta be the focus, that could be really neat. I hadn't thought about trying to change the call to actions, but you're right. I mean, they're the same that they've been for decades. And with this knowledge in hand, we should feel empowered. We could even add a little piece about, you know, we tell people to try to get to the interior of your room and everything else, but we don't tell them just how safe they'll be when they do that. You know, if you get to an interior room of a built home, you will do, you know, you can expect to be quite safe, and that could maybe go a long way in helping that PTSD that people are experiencing. Because if you're sitting there, and I've been in that position, you probably all have too. It's horrible being sheltered and just waiting, and you feel like, oh my gosh, it's going to get me. Like, how could I possibly survive this? To offer some reassurance that, you know, you're doing the best thing you can. And you really, I mean, and that's the epidemiology studies. I should note, you know, we have this 1% fatality rate, you know, that I mentioned, but that was only for F5 and F4 tornadoes. The fatality rate then for EF3s down to EF0s is much, much less. I mean, fatalities are really, they sometimes happen, you know, in EF3s and EF2s in mobile homes and in cars, but the preponderance of fatalities really are those higher end tornadoes. And of the more than 1,000 tornadoes that happen in the U.S. each year, we only have maybe 1 to 3, you know, on average, sort of F4, F5s. The fatalities get really isolated into just a couple of events, except in the Southeast where there's more mobile homes, and they get these like all the time. They're getting like 5 to 10 people who die in a couple tornadoes. But it's important to it's a nice thing to think about messaging. Like, yeah, you can actually get really safe in every tornado that occurs. You can feel very confident in just getting in that bathroom.
Hi, Kim, this is Chelsea Burnett. I wanted to make a comment about the things you talked about because it really hit home. I'm with an organization here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area called Texas Storm Chasers, and we've been giving severe weather awareness presentations to the public since 2018. And I will say that our area has seen probably more new people from out of state, from out of the country, who truly have no idea what our springs are like here. So that really gave me an idea to hit these adult talks home with that delta that you talked about. You know, instead of just saying you need to be here, 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 we need to engage in conversation and say, you know, where are you exactly? And, you know, based on where you're at, these are the things that you can do. So I just want to say thank you for giving us, you know, those tools and that information to have those conversations.
Well, thank you. That's what's wonderful to know that that resonated. And thank you for the great work that you're doing. It's that grassroots stuff that's really going to make the difference. Thank you.
So I'm very curious from the IWT perspective. I know Oklahoma City's market is rather unique. That's an interesting way to put it. But with regards to, you know, having somewhat of a paradigm shift in the way that things are going to be approached, do you have specific insight or suggestions on how to bridge that gap? Just seeing the picture and the quote from Mike Morgan and, you know, this discrepancy, it's just, I don't know, I was just curious if you had any additional thoughts on that.
You know, sometimes the Oklahoma City market, yeah, it's a special creature. And I can't imagine trying to be a broadcast meteorologist here. Can you imagine how hard it would be to have 700 meteorologists sitting in Norman looking down their nose at you, critiquing every single thing you do every day? I mean, this is an experience of, I think, being on social media, putting yourself out there and having people critique you doesn't feel very good. What do people tend to do when that happens? They get defensive. And I think that there's something about the Norman Oklahoma City relationship that has bred attention. And you can see it anytime there's a severe weather event. Just get on Twitter, watch people in the Weather Center and how they take down the broadcasters. They're just waiting for whatever to happen. It can be ferocious. And we're trying to do things with the broadcast sector. With some of our testbed activities, we do end user engagement. And gosh, wouldn't it be convenient if we had broadcasters from Oklahoma City that could come in, the cheapest travel ever, right? Instead of having to bring people from New Jersey, like we could bring people here, and they won't come. They won't come because they have feelings. They're humans and they have had their feelings hurt. So, one of the things that our sort of social science cohort that does this end user engagement is trying to do is work with our media team to sort of tamp down, set some standards for social media and just try to treat people who put themselves out there day after day in a way that you don't have to, try to treat them with some respect and have a little bit of dignity in those interactions, have some empathy. I can sit here and critique Mike Morgan for what he said. Honestly, in the heat of that moment, I can't imagine what he felt. I have been a little more disappointed in him standing by it after the fact. But again, I can't imagine what it's like to live in that defensive, with what he had to have faced after that. That's something I'll hopefully never have to endure. So we can all, I think, just try to have a little bit more empathy. In this problem space, I think that would help, and in pretty much every problem space. Man, this has been a great discussion. I really appreciate being able to be here with you all, and hope that we all share the best that we can in this round 2 of COVID and severe weather season. So it's gonna be a fun one.
Thank you very much for your time. If you're not any other questions, I guess we can talk briefly about any kind of chapter business. If you want to hang on, you're more than welcome to. And I'll be in touch. We have a small gift to send with you as well. But again, I really appreciate it, and it was a fantastic presentation.
Well, I really appreciated the time with all of you, and I could tell how much you enjoyed it. I could see just seeing the look in everybody's faces. It's not the same as being in person, but you all were very expressive, and I appreciated it. So thank you very much. I think I'm going to go And after the day of working and then having two very small children that are very special right now, we have a 2-year-old and 6-month-old, I'm going to go put my feet up. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Okay. I don't have anything specific to address with regards to chapter business other than just to remind you that so our next meeting will be next month. I'm still lining out the details of who the speaker will be, but most likely it will probably be Tim Marshall. And the other would be the elections will be the following meeting as well. And if you have any dues to submit to the chapter, feel free to contact us with all of that information as well. And with that, if Greg, if you have any other comments or Stan, feel free to jump in. But that was really all I had for this evening.
No, ma'am. I believe you've covered it quite well. Thank you for arranging for Dr. Kim to join us this evening.
Yeah, no problem. Well, if there's not any other comments, I hope everyone has a good evening, and we will be in touch and talk to you next month.